Verses on Consciousness Only. By Bodhisattva Vasubandhu. Translated into Chinese by the Dharma teacher of the Tripitaka, Xian Sang of the Great Tang Dynasty. Translated from the Chinese. By Francis H. Cook. Introduction to the treatise in 20 verses on consciousness only.
The brief verse work translated here and known commonly as the 20 verses should be read along with its companion piece, the 30 verses, which appears previously in this volume. These two short verse treatises by the Indian Buddhist scholar monk, Vasubandhu, who lived during the 4th century, set forth the philosophical position that characterizes the Yogacara school. But whereas the 30 verses is devoted to systematically discussing kinds of consciousness, the theory of seeds stored in the store consciousness, the nature of delusion and enlightenment, the process of eliminating false imagination and discrimination, and other aspects of Yogacara thought, the 20 verses is devoted to defending this teaching against possible counterarguments by Buddhists and non-Buddhist opponents.
The 20 verses is a series of hypothetical objections by possible opponents with replies by Vasubandhu. The objections of opponents are philosophically realistic arguments. In all cases, the opponent takes the realistic, no-nonsense position that the things seen, heard, smelled, etc., are real things that exist in the world outside the mind. The opponent typically offers an argument as to why it cannot be possible for perceived objects to be merely mental constructs, and non-existent apart from consciousness, which is Vasubandhu's position. Along with this, he offers reasoned arguments as to why perceived objects must necessarily really exist apart from consciousness. That is why he is a realist. Vasubandhu counters each argument, explaining why the realistic argument is faulty and, at the same time, why objects of perception cannot rationally be considered to exist apart from consciousness.
Consequently, Vasubandhu's work is to respond to what may be seen as the main counter-arguments to the Yogacara position. He responds to such arguments as the claim that if perceived events do not exist outside consciousness, we ought not to be held karmically responsible for our deeds, which do not really exist apart from mind. He responds also to the argument that since we all have diverse karmic histories, we ought not all to see the same things at the same time if these events are only mental fabrications. Commonality of experiences argues for their objective reality. Likewise, he counters the argument that if other beings are only mental constructs, either we cannot meaningfully speak of knowing another's mind or else the other really does exist outside of mind. In arguing against these and a number of other objections, Vasubandhu displays a powerful grasp of Buddhist doctrine and an impressive mastery of logical reasoning.
The 20 verses is number 1590 in volume 31 of the Teisho Shinshur Daizokyo. The text, translated from the Sanskrit by the Chinese monk Xian Sang, consists of a series of verses interspersed with prose commentary, Vasubandhu's own commentary on his verses. I have numbered the verses for the convenience of the reader because on several occasions the verse is commented on in pieces. I have thus labeled the 4 naturally occurring parts of a verse A, B, C, and a QD. The reader will also note that the 20 verses actually contains 21 verses, not 20. The final verse is not part of the arguments, but rather Vasubandhu's confession of inadequacy and his praise for Buddhas, who alone know all the fine points of the doctrine. Readers who compare this translation with those made from the Sanskrit will also notice discrepancies in the number and numbering of the Chinese and Sanskrit versions. Verse number 1 in the Chinese text is verse number 2 in the Sanskrit version, which has a different first verse. The Sanskrit text thus has 22 verses.
The Chinese text has been translated once before, by Clarence C. Hamilton, Wei Shi Shi Luan, or the Treatise in 20 Stanzas on Representation Only, New Haven, American Oriental Society, 1938, reprinted by Krauss Reprint Corporation, New York, 1962. The Sanskrit text was translated and discussed by Stefan Anaker, 7 Works of Vasubandhu, Delhi, Motilal Banarsidass, 1984, and Thomas A. Kachamuddam, A Buddhist Doctrine of Experience, Delhi, Motilal Banarsidass, 1982. Xian Sang's disciple, Kui Chi, wrote an indispensable commentary on the 20 verses, Wei Shi Luan Shu Chi, Teisho Shinshur Daizokyo, Volume 43, number 1834. Most writers on Buddhist teachings in general or Yogacara thought in particular have discussed the doctrine of consciousness only to one degree of adequacy or another.
The three realms are consciousness only. Of the Mahayana is established through the scriptural expression, the three realms are mind only. Mind, thought, consciousness, and perception are different names. Here, mind and thought are lumped together with mental activities. Only excludes objects of perception that are external to consciousness, not associates of consciousness. When internal consciousness is born, it appears resembling external objects of perception, but, in the same way that one with diseased eyesight sees, non-existent, hairs, flies, etc. Here there is not the slightest aspect of reality. Regarding this concept, there are some doubts. A verse says,
If consciousness is without real objects of perception, the restriction of place and time, the non-restriction of mental continuity, and function would not be established.
The treatise asks, what does this mean? If you reject the idea that consciousness really has external dharmas such as form and that consciousness of form, etc., arises conditioned by external form, etc., why does this consciousness arise in some places but not in all places? Why does consciousness of form, etc., occur in one place at one time but not at all times? When there are many mental continuities in the same single place at one time, why is consciousness of form not born restricted according to just one consciousness, just as one with diseased eyesight sees hairs, flies, etc., but this consciousness is not born in someone without the disease? Again, asks the realist, why are the imaginary hairs, etc., seen by those with eye disease lacking in the function of real hair, etc.? Food, drink, swords, cudgels, poison, medicines, clothes, etc., in a dream are devoid of the function of food, etc. The Gandharv city, etc., is devoid of the function of a real city, etc., but the function of other things such as real hair is not non-existent. If dreams and waking are really the same, without external objects of perception such as form, and there is only internal consciousness that is born resembling an external objective realm, the restriction of place and time, non-restriction of mental continuities, and the functioning of things would not be demonstrated.
We reply, they are not all not demonstrated. A verse says, time and place are restricted as in dreams. The body is not restricted, just as, hungry, ghosts all alike see pus rivers, etc. And just as in dreams loss of semen has a function.
The treatise says, the meaning of as in dreams is that it is like what is seen in dreams. That is, just as in a dream there are no real objects of perception and still in one place one can see a village, garden, men and women, etc., but not in all places, and at this place at a certain time one can see a village, garden, etc., but not at all times. Consequently, although there are no real objects of perception external to consciousness, restriction of time and place are not undemonstrable.
The treatise says, as ghosts means hungry ghosts. The rivers, they see, are filled with pus and are therefore called pus rivers. In the same way one speaks of a pot filled with ghee as a ghee pot, this means that just as through the maturation of the same actions the many bodies of hungry ghosts collect together, in the netherworld, and all see the pus rivers, it is not that in this situation, it is restricted so only one sees it. The word etc. means that they also may see excrement, etc., and sentient beings grasping swords and cudgels, defending and guarding food and not allowing the hungry ghosts to get food.
Consequently, even though there are no real objects of perception apart from consciousness, still the non-restriction of many mental continuities is demonstrated. Also, just as in a dream the objects of perception are devoid of reality, yet there is a function for such things as loss of semen, etc. As a result of this, although there are no real objects of perception apart from consciousness, still, the concept of a function that is false, in a waking state, is demonstrated. Thus, by using different similes, the four concepts such as restriction of place are demonstrated. Again, the next verse says,
all, for concepts, are like beings in hell, who alike see infernal guardians, etc., and are made to be injured. Therefore the four concepts are all demonstrated.
The treatise says, you should know that here, the single example of hell shows that restrictions of place, etc., are all demonstrated. The words, like hell, refer to various kinds of sentient beings who reside in hell and experience injury and suffering. That is, even though in hell there are no real sentient beings that include such things as infernal guardians, still, because of the dominant power of the maturation of identical acts of those sentient beings, many individual mental continuities in the same place, at the same time, all are like infernal guardians, dogs, crows, iron mountains, etc., coming to them to inflict injury. As a result of this example, even though there are no real objects of perception apart from consciousness, still, the four concepts of restriction of place, etc., are demonstrated.
The opponent asks, why not admit that species such as infernal guardians are real sentient beings? We respond, because it does not correspond to reason. Now, these guardians should not be included with beings in Naraka because they do not experience suffering in the way the others experience it, and if they, i.e., guardians and those being tormented, harm each other, then you cannot establish some as being suffering in Naraka and others as infernal guardians. Since all are alike in size, shape, and power, they would not fear each other very much. They themselves, the infernal guardians, would not be able to bear the suffering of the constant burning of the fierce fires of iron earth, etc., so how would they be able to inflict injury on others? If they are not infernal beings, they ought not to be born there.
Objection: how do animals appear in the celestial realm? It is the same with Naraka. Animals, ghosts, etc., act as infernal guardians, etc. We reply, this remedy, to your argument, is unsuitable. A verse says, "What is true of animals in the celestial realm is not true for those beings in the hells. Because the animals and ghosts you assert do not experience that suffering."
The treatise says that with regard to animals being born in the celestial realm, they must have past karma that enables them to experience the happiness of that world, and being born in that world, they definitely experience the happiness born of that world. The infernal guardians, etc., do not experience the suffering in hell that is born of that world. Therefore we should not admit that those with the destinations of animals or ghosts are born in Naraka.
Objection: if that is so, then you must admit that the dominant power of karma of beings born in Naraka produces unusual great elements that give rise to special shapes that display different sizes and power, and upon whom we bestow such names as infernal guardian in order to generate fear in those reborn in hell. They have different functions such as changing and appearing in various ways and moving their hands and feet, etc., like mountains that look like rams suddenly coming together, butting horns, and separating, or like thorns in the iron forest drooping down or lifting up, to impale the unfortunate sufferer. We reply, it is not that these events are totally non-existent, however, your argument does not correspond to reason. A verse says,
If you admit that as a result of the power of action unusual great elements are born, and they produce such changes, why not admit that they occur in consciousness? The treatise asks, why do you not admit that consciousness, as a result of the power of action, transforms like this, yet assert great elements? Again, the next verse says, perfuming of action is in one place, and you assert that the result exists elsewhere, that the result exists in the perfumed consciousness. You do not admit, why is that?
The treatise says, you assert that beings in Naraka produce special great elements born of the power of their own action and give rise to changes of shapes, etc. The perfuming of their action must logically be admitted as being in their individual continuities of consciousness and nowhere else. There is a perfumed consciousness, but then you will not admit that there is a transformation of the result. Where there is no perfumed place, you turn around and assert that the result exists. Why is this? The opponent replies, Scripture is the reason. That is, if there is only consciousness that appears resembling form, etc., where there is no form, etc., the Buddha would not have spoken of the sense bases of form, etc. We reply, this teaching is no reason for your position, because it has a special meaning. A verse says,